At 3:10 Friday afternoon, Fisher still hadn't arrived on top, says Beidelman, adding, I decided it was time to get the hell out of there, even though Scott hadn't showed up yet. He gathered up Pittman, Gamelgard, Fox, and Madsen and started leading them down the summit ridge. 20 minutes later, just above the Hillary step, they ran into Fisher. I didn't really say anything to him, Beidelman recalls. He just sort of raised his hand. He looked like he was having a hard time, but he was Scott, so I wasn't particularly worried. I figured he'd tag the summit and catch up to us pretty quick to help bring the clients down. Beidelman's primary concern at the time was Pittman. Everybody was pretty messed up by that point, but Sandy looked especially shaky. I thought that if I didn't keep real close tabs on her, there was a good chance she'd peel right off the ridge. So I made sure she was clipped into the fixed line, and in the places where there was no rope, I grabbed her harness from behind and kept a tight hold on her until she could clip into the next section of rope. She was so out of it that I'm not sure she even knew I was there. A short distance below the south summit, as the climbers descended into thick clouds and falling snow, Pittman collapsed again and asked Fox to give her an injection of a powerful steroid called dexamethasone. Dex, as it is known, can temporarily negate the deleterious effect of altitude. Following the instructions of Dr. Ingrid Hunt, each member of Fisher's team carried a pre-prepared syringe of the drug in a plastic toothbrush case inside his or her down suit, where it wouldn't freeze for emergencies. I pulled aside Sandy's pants a little, Fox recalls, and jammed the needle into her hip, right through her long underwear and everything. Beidelman, who had lingered at the south summit to inventory oxygen, arrived on the scene to see Fox plunging the syringe into Pittman, stretched out face down on the snow. When I came over the rise and saw Sandy lying there, with Charlotte standing over her waving a hypodermic needle, I thought, oh crap, this looks bad. So I asked Sandy what was going on, and when she tried to answer, all that came out of her mouth was a bunch of garbled babble. Extremely concerned, Beidelman ordered Gamelgard to exchange her full oxygen canister with Pittman's nearly empty one, made sure her regulator was turned to full flow, then grabbed the semi-comatose Pittman by her harness and started dragging her down the steep snow of the southeast ridge. Once I got her sliding, he explains, I let go and glissade down in front of her. Every 50 meters I'd stop, wrap my hands around a fixed rope, and brace myself to arrest her slide with a body block. The first time Sandy came barreling into me, the points of her crampons sliced through my down suit. Feathers went flying everywhere. To everyone's relief, after about 20 minutes the injection and extra oxygen revived Pittman, and she was able to resume the descent under her own power. Around 5 p.m., as Beidelman accompanied his clients down the ridge, Mike Groom and Yasuko Namba were arriving at the balcony some 500 feet below them. From this promontory at 27,600 feet, the route veers sharply off the ridge to the south toward Camp 4. When Groom looked in the other direction, however, down the north side of the ridge, through the billowing snow and faltering light, he noticed a lone climber badly off route. It was Martin Adams, who become disoriented in the storm and mistakenly started to descend the Kangshung face into Tibet. As soon as Adams saw Groom and Namba above him, he realized his mistake and climbed slowly back toward the balcony. Martin was out by the time he got back up to Yasuko and me. Groom recalls, his oxygen mask was off and his face was encrusted in snow. He asked, which way to the tents? Groom pointed, and Adams immediately started down the correct side of the ridge, following the trail I blazed perhaps 10 minutes earlier. While Groom was waiting for Adams to climb back up to the ridge, he sent Namba down ahead and busied himself trying to find a camera case he'd left on the way up. As he was looking around, for the first time he noticed another person on the balcony with him. Because he was sort of camouflaged in the snow, I took him to be one of Fisher's group, and I ignored him. Then this person was standing in front of me saying, "Hi, Mike," and I realized it was Beck. Groom, just as surprised to see Beck as I had been, got out his rope and began short roping the Texan down toward the south col. Beck was so hopelessly blind, Groom reports, that every 10 meters he'd take a step into thin air, and I'd have to catch him with the rope. I was worried he was going to pull me off many times. It was bloody nerve-wracking. I had to make sure I had a good ice axe belay and that all my points were clean and sticking into something solid at all times. One by one, following the tracks I had made 15 or 20 minutes earlier, Bidelman and the remainder of Fisher's clients filed down through the worsening blizzard. Adams was behind me, ahead of the others. Then came Namba, Groom and Weathers, Schoening and Gamelgar, Bidelman, and finally Pittman, Fox, and Madsen. 500 feet above the South Col, where the steep shale gave way to a gentler slope of snow, Namba's oxygen ran out, and the diminutive Japanese woman sat down, refusing to move. When I tried to take her oxygen mask off so she could breathe more easily, says Groom, she'd insist on putting it right back on. No amount of persuasion could convince her that she was out of oxygen, that the mask was actually suffocating her. By now, Beck had weakened to the point where he wasn't able to walk on his own, and I had to support him on my shoulder. Fortunately, right about then Neil caught up to us. Bidelman, seeing that Groom had his hands full with Weathers, started dragging Namba down toward Camp 4, even though she wasn't on Fisher's team. It was now about 6:45 p.m., and almost completely dark. Bidelman, Groom, their clients, and 2 Sherpas from Fisher's team who had belatedly materialized out of the mist, Tashi Charing and Nawang Dorje, had coalesced into a single group. Although they were moving slowly, they had descended to within 200 vertical feet of Camp 4. At that moment, I was just arriving at the tents, probably no more than 15 minutes in front of the first members of Bidelman's group. But in that brief span, the storm abruptly metastasized into a full-blown hurricane, and the visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Wanting to avoid the dangerous ice pitch, Bidelman led his group on an indirect route that looped far to the east, where the slope was much less steep, and around 7:30 they safely reached the broad, gently rolling expanse of the South Col. By then, however, only 3 or 4 people had headlamps with batteries that hadn't run down, and everyone was on the brink of physical collapse. Fox was increasingly relying on Madsen for assistance. Weathers and Namba were unable to walk without being supported by Groom and Bidelman, respectively. Bidelman knew they were on the eastern, Tibetan side of the col, and that the tents lay somewhere to the west. But to move in that direction, it was necessary to walk directly upwind into the teeth of the storm. Wind-whipped granules of ice and snow struck the climbers' faces with violent force, lacerating their eyes and making it impossible to see where they were going. It was so difficult and painful, Schoening explains, that there was an inevitable tendency to bear off the wind, to keep angling away from to the left, and that's how we went wrong. At times you couldn't even see your own feet. It was blowing so hard, he continues. I was worried somebody would sit down or get separated from the group, and we'd never see them again. But once we got the flats of the col, we started following the Sherpas, and I figured they knew where camp was. Then they suddenly stopped and doubled back, and it quickly became obvious they didn't have any idea where we were. At that point, I got a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. That's when I first knew we were in trouble. For the next 2 hours, Bidelman, Groom, the 2 Sherpas, and the 7 clients staggered blindly around in the storm, growing ever more exhausted and hypothermic, hoping to blunder across the camp. Once they came across a couple of discarded oxygen bottles, suggesting that the tents were near, but the climbers couldn't locate them. It was total chaos, says Bidelman. People are wandering all over the place. I'm yelling at everyone, trying to get them to follow a single leader. Finally, probably around 10 o'clock, I walked over this little rise, and it felt like I was standing on the edge of the earth. I could sense a huge void just beyond. The group had unwittingly strayed to the easternmost edge of the col, at the lip of a 7,000 foot drop down the Kangshung face. They were at the same elevation as Camp 4, just 1,000 horizontal feet from safety, but, says Bidelman, I knew that if we kept wandering in the storm, pretty soon we were going to lose somebody. I was exhausted from dragging Yasuko. Charlotte and Sandy were barely able to stand. So I screamed at everyone to huddle up right there and wait for a break in the storm. Although a strong climber might require 3 hours to ascend 1,000 vertical feet. In this case, the distance was over more or less flat terrain, which the group would have been able to cover in perhaps 15 minutes had they known where the tents were. Beidelman and Schoening searched for a protected place to escape the wind, but there was nowhere to hide. Everyone's oxygen had long since run out, making the group more vulnerable to the wind chill, which exceeded 100 below zero. In the lee of a boulder no larger than a dishwasher, the climbers hunkered in a pathetic row on a patch of gale-scoured ice. "By then the cold had about finished me off," says Charlotte Fox. "My eyes were frozen. I didn't see how we were going to get out of it alive. The cold was so painful, I didn't think I could endure it anymore. I just curled up in a ball and hoped death would come quickly. We tried to keep warm by pummeling each other. Weathers remembers. Someone yelled at us to keep moving our arms and legs. Sandy was hysterical. She kept yelling over and over, 'I don't want to die. I don't want to die.' But nobody else was saying a whole lot,